JD Vance stepped up to that microphone, and in less than 4 minutes, he made every single one of those assumptions look catastrophically naive. The announcement didn't come with warning shots. There was no dramatic buildup, no carefully choreographed diplomatic tension, no last-minute back-channel negotiations that gave European capitals time to brace for impact. Vance simply walked into the room, stood at the podium with the composure of a man who had already made peace with the decision he was about to deliver, and systematically dismantled the foundational structure of Western security in a statement that was measured, methodical, and absolutely devastating in its implications. 75 years. That's how long NATO had stood as the defining pillar of the global order. 75 years of shared sacrifice, of American soldiers sleeping on European soil, of a nuclear guarantee that kept Soviet ambitions in check and later kept Russian adventurism from spiraling into something far more dangerous. 3/4 of a century of an alliance that was not merely a military arrangement, but a philosophical statement about what the Western world stood for and how it intended to defend itself. And it ended not with a war, not with a catastrophic failure of diplomacy, but with an American vice president reading from a prepared statement while defense ministers across the Atlantic reached for their phones with trembling hands. April 2026 will not be remembered gently by history. This is the month that historians will return to again and again when they try to explain how the post-war international order finally came apart. Not in a blaze of conflict, but in the quiet, almost bureaucratic language of an official government announcement that carried the weight of a detonation. When Vance said the words, and they came without hesitation or apology, that the United States was formally beginning the withdrawal process from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the room didn't erupt. It froze. Completely, utterly, silently froze. Translators stopped translating. Note-takers stopped writing. The German delegation looked at each other the way people look at each other when something happens that they had theorized about but never truly believed they would witness. The sound of a pen hitting the marble floor was the only noise for several seconds that felt like they belonged to a different era entirely. What came next made the initial shock look like a warm-up, because Vance had not arrived simply to deliver a headline. He arrived with the full architecture of American disengagement mapped out in precise, numbered detail, and he walked through every piece of it with the calm of someone reading an inventory rather than ending an alliance. First came the financial reality. American contributions represent the overwhelming financial backbone of NATO's operational capacity, covering the lion's share of everything from command infrastructure to satellite communication networks to joint logistics systems that allow 20-something different national militaries to function as a single coherent force. Vance announced the immediate suspension of all of it. Not a reduction, not a renegotiation, not a temporary freeze pending further discussions, a suspension, effective immediately. European members had been warned through administration after administration that the arithmetic of American patience had limits, that if they continued treating NATO's collective defense budget as something Washington would perpetually subsidize while they redirected their own resources toward domestic spending, eventually, someone in the American government would decide that the warning period was over, that someone was now standing at a podium telling them their time had expired. But the money was only the beginning. Vance then announced the recall of every senior American military commander embedded within NATO's joint command structure, every general, every admiral, every strategic planner who carried inside their head the classified protocols, the operational relationships, the institutional knowledge that separates a functional military alliance from a collection of armies that happen to share a logo. Within 90 days, all of them would be gone. And anyone who understands how military organizations actually function understands what that means. It doesn't mean NATO weakens. It means NATO loses the connective tissue that makes it capable of coordinated response. The muscle can still exist, but without the nervous system connecting it, the muscle cannot move in the right direction at the right time with the right precision. European defense establishments had spent decades embedding American commanders into their systems at every level, precisely because American expertise and American institutional knowledge had become load-bearing walls in the architecture of European defense. Those walls were now being removed, and Europe was going to discover very quickly whether what remained could stand on its own. The scenes that unfolded across European capitals in the hours following the announcement were unlike anything seen on the continent in decades. Emergency parliamentary sessions were convened in cities where the scheduled business of the day had been entirely mundane. The German Bundestag was interrupted mid-session to deal with what senior officials were privately calling the most serious national security rupture since reunification. In Paris, the Élysée Palace essentially went dark to the outside world as the French president gathered his entire security apparatus and worked through the night trying to construct a coherent response to a situation for which no contingency plan had ever seriously been developed. In the Baltic states, in Poland, in every nation that sits closest to Russia's military reach, governments began the grim exercise of recalculating their defensive postures in a world where the American guarantee no longer existed. The math was not reassuring in any of those capitals. And then there was Brussels, and there was Ursula von der Leyen. For years, she had been the face of European ambition, the woman who stood before packed parliamentary chambers and spoke about strategic autonomy with the kind of polished certainty that makes people believe you've already built the thing you're describing. She championed the idea of a Europe that could defend itself, that could project power, that could exist in the world as a sovereign strategic actor rather than as a dependent of American military willingness. She gave those speeches with conviction. She gave them repeatedly. She gave them so often and so well that a significant portion of the European political establishment began to mistake the vision for the reality. They were not the same thing. They were not even close to the same thing. When von der Leyen stood before the European Parliament just hours after Vance's announcement, she did what skilled politicians do when confronted with a crisis they cannot solve. She spoke the language of resolve. She used words like resilience and collective strength and historic mission. She framed the moment not as a catastrophe, but as an opportunity, a forcing function that would finally compel Europe to become what it had always claimed it was becoming. It was a technically accomplished performance, but the members sitting in that chamber and the defense analysts watching from around the world understood what the speech was carefully not saying, that the strategic independence von der Leyen was now urgently calling for required a decade of investment that had not happened, that the defense manufacturing capacity she was describing as the path forward had not been built during the years when they had time and resources to build it, that the ammunition stockpiles, the advanced weapons systems, the trained personnel, the unified command structures necessary to replace even a fraction of American capability were not waiting somewhere ready to be activated. They didn't exist, not at the required scale, not anywhere near it. The most alarming revelation didn't come from the podium. It came from the intelligence networks, from the defense systems, from the quiet technical reports that began flowing into European defense ministries in the hours after Vance's announcement confirmed that the restriction of American satellite data and signals intelligence was not a negotiating posture. It was operational reality. European air defense networks that had been built on the assumption of continuous access to American satellite tracking suddenly found themselves with significant gaps in their awareness of what was moving through the skies over the continent's most vulnerable eastern approaches. Naval vessels equipped with the most sophisticated targeting and navigation systems that money could buy discovered that those systems were more dependent on American digital infrastructure than any public specification had ever acknowledged. And then came the most embarrassing revelation of all, the one that several governments actively tried to suppress before it leaked anyway. Several European air forces operating their most advanced, most expensive, most cutting-edge combat aircraft discovered that without American software feeds, encrypted communication protocols, and satellite-linked navigation data, those aircraft were operating at a dramatically reduced capability. Level, not grounded, not useless, but significantly, measurably embarrassingly diminished from what their governments had paid for and what their military doctrine had been built around. The planes could fly, the weapons could fire, but the precision, the integration, the real-time battlefield awareness that defines the difference between a modern air force and an expensive approximation of one, all of that was contingent on American systems that had just been switched off. It was a dependency that had never been acknowledged publicly, because acknowledging it would have been politically catastrophic. And now the acknowledgement was unavoidable, because the dependency was visible in real time on every operational screen across the continent. In Moscow, none of this was surprising. In Moscow, this was the scenario that had been gamed out, prepared for, and anticipated with a patience that Western governments systematically underestimated over years of wishful strategic thinking. Russian state media, which had spent months treating American NATO threats as posturing, shifted its entire editorial register within hours of Vance's announcement. The tone that emerged was not triumphalist exactly. It was something more dangerous than triumphalism. It was the tone of recognition, the specific energy of people who had correctly predicted something and were now watching it unfold exactly as modeled. Military analysts with documented connections to Russian defense circles began publishing detailed assessments of European vulnerability timelines with the precision of people who had been maintaining those assessments for years and were now simply updating them with current data. Along the eastern frontier, in the border regions that Russian military planners have studied intensely since the beginning of the Ukraine conflict, reports began filtering in of activity that hadn't been present the previous week. The timing was deliberate. It always was. Because Putin is many things, but one thing he unquestionably is a strategist who understands that uncertainty is its own form of pressure, that the period of maximum danger is not when a threat is carried out, but when the target doesn't yet know whether it will be. The phone calls between European leaders in those hours were not what the subsequent press releases described them as. They were not strategic consultations between confident governments coordinating a unified response. They were leaders confronting a reality they had collectively avoided preparing for, because preparation would have required honesty with their own populations about exactly how much of European security was American product, American investment, American commitment, consumed by European nations that had long since calculated that the bill would never actually come due. The bill had come due. And the invoice was for capabilities that didn't exist, stockpiles that weren't there, manufacturing capacity that had never been built, and unified political will that remained perpetually just over the horizon of the next summit, the next declaration, the next carefully worded joint communique that substituted language for action and ambition for capability. Von der Leyen appeared before the cameras one final time as the day moved toward its close. She was composed. She is always composed. She spoke of Europe's future with the forward-leaning vocabulary of someone who intends to be on the right side of whatever history writes about this period. She used the word resilience several more times. She spoke of this moment as a turning point rather than a breaking point. She said the things that leaders say when the situation demands that someone say something that sounds like a plan, even when the plan is still being desperately assembled from whatever pieces are available. But the question that hung over everything she said, the question that no amount of polished parliamentary delivery could dissolve, was the same question being asked simultaneously in every defense ministry from Lisbon to the Baltic coast. Europe now stands in a strategic position it has not occupied since before the Marshall Plan. America has stepped back. The Eastern threat has not. The window between today and the moment European defense capability reaches genuine self-sufficiency is not measured in months. It is measured in years. And the question of what fills that window, who fills it, and what it costs to fill it is now the most consequential open question in the world. Because history, unlike European parliamentary procedure, does not wait for the next scheduled session. It moves when the conditions are right. And right now, the conditions are very, very interesting.